This is Professor Klorman speaking. If you're having a little trouble recognizing me, I guess it's been a little bit since I've had a haircut. But we're here today to talk about music theory and specifically the harmonic functions of tonic, subdominant, and dominant. And I want to look at how those functions are expressed when we hear cadences. We're going to look at two examples, a keyboard piece by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and a song by Louise Reichardt. Let's begin. This is one of Mozart's best-known piano sonatas. What we have here is the theme from a set of theme and variations. Let's listen to just the first 8 measures, up to the repeat sign. How many phrases do you hear? Which clues in the music give a sense of where phrases begin and end? I'd like to suggest that we might divide this into 2 phrases, which form a kind of question and answer pair, or what music theorists call an antecedent phrase and a consequent phrase. But what is it that makes the antecedent phrase sound like a question, like something open-ended? And what makes the consequent phrase sound like an answer, like something more closed or complete? Let's consider the harmonic analysis. I've labeled just 3 main harmonies for the antecedent phrase. A more detailed harmonic analysis would show even more chords than I've shown here. But for now, I've used a dotted line to show how the opening harmony, the A major chord, returns on the downbeat of measure 4, almost as if this tonic harmony is expanded to last for several measures. That's what the dotted line is showing. So the main harmonies of this antecedent phrase are tonic expanded, moving to 2/6, that's a subdominant function, and then coming to rest on a 5 chord expressing a dominant function. The arrival on a half cadence lends measure 4 a tentative or questioning quality. A half cadence marks the end of the antecedent phrase, but it remains harmonically open. That is, it calls for some music to follow to provide a more conclusive cadence. Once again, I've marked only the main harmonies for the consequent phrase. Let's listen to the first 8 measures once again, and let's think about how the consequent phrase resembles the antecedent, and also how it differs. You'll notice that measures 5 to 6 are identical to measures 1 and 2. But when Mozart reaches measure 7, he accelerates the pace of the consequent phrase. For instance, if you compare measure 7 to measure 3, in measure 3 we had A, B, B, C sharp, whereas in measure 7 it's A, B, C sharp. It's like we're traversing the same territory, but just a little bit quicker pace. And the reason to speed up the pace is because this consequent phrase has further to go harmonically, since it needs to get all the way to a tonic chord to provide a more conclusive cadence, a cadence that goes from 5/7 to 1. So, which type of cadence do we have at the end of the consequent phrase? The music proceeds from subdominant to tonic, 2/6, 5/7, 1. What is the name of this type of cadence? So this would be a perfect authentic cadence, PAC. It's authentic because it's a root position 5 chord going to root position 1. And it's perfect because the final harmony has the tonic note in the soprano. This is the strongest kind of cadence there is, the strongest type of closure, which gives our consequent phrase a feeling of being a statement or an answer. The antecedent was open-ended, it ended on 5. The consequent phrase gives us closure. It ends on 1 with the tonic note in the soprano. Now let's move on to the next section of the piece. The overall form of this theme is something like an ABA form. We've already analyzed the A section, measures 1 through 8. So next we have what I'm going to call a contrasting middle. I'll call it that because it comes in the middle and it introduces a contrasting melody. And then in measure 13, you'll hear the return of music based on the consequent phrase. So it makes an A, B, A overall. Let's listen from the contrasting middle to the end of the theme. I've marked one harmony that we'll skip for now in our analysis, since we haven't yet studied how to analyze it. Also, as usual, we'll skip any notes that appear in triangles, since we haven't yet studied how to analyze them. We'll get to those notes soon enough in this course. As we listen from the contrasting middle to the end of the theme, how many phrases do you hear? Or to put it another way, where do you hear cadences? Which cadences seem to be strong ones, harmonically closed, and which seem to be weaker or harmonically open? The first cadence we hear is in measure 12, at the end of the contrasting middle. And I'll point out that up to this point in the piece, we've really been hearing it in units of 4 bars, plus 4 bars, plus 4 bars. We can basically distill the contrasting middle down to the progression 1, 5. What do I mean by that? The contrasting middle begins by emphasizing or expanding the tonic harmony. If we focus on the left hand, we'll notice that A is the lowest note for each of the arpeggios. In other words, we have La, Do, Mi, La, Re, Fa, La, Re, Fa, La, Do, Mi, La. So the A keeps getting emphasized. In fact, you could almost imagine as if we had a sustained A in the bass that whole time. This is what music theorists call an A pedal, or a tonic pedal. We use the word pedal because you could imagine if you were playing the organ, you might put your foot on the pedal for A to sustain an A in the bass. And the idea of A as a bass note continues in measure 11 through the downbeat of measure 12, since we have in the bass La, Sol, La. We're going to learn later in the course this is sometimes called a neighboring progression, where A is the main note and G sharp is like a kind of decoration. But then we progress to a new main harmony, to the dominant at the end of the bar, marking an arrival at a half cadence. As we've already discussed, half cadences represent a sense of tension because they are harmonically open. They call for music to follow that will provide harmonic closure to resolve the tension. In ABA forms with contrasting middles, it's common for the B section, or contrasting middle, to end on a half cadence, since it heightens the listener's yearning for an A section to return at the recapitulation, to resolve those tensions, to provide harmonic closure. By recapitulation, I simply mean a return of the A material. Now, if the recapitulation were identical to the consequent phrase, then it would last exactly 4 measures. But Mozart's recapitulation is 6 bars long. Why? The answer has to do with the 2 cadences in the recapitulation, which I've marked with asterisks. Why does Mozart compose 2 cadences? Well, measures 13 to 16 are almost identical to the consequent phrase, except right at the cadence. Instead of La, Si, Do, Re, Do, Si, La, Mozart writes Do, Si, Si, Do. So What kind of cadence do we have there in bar 16, and why does it require some music to come after it? The answer is that measure 16 is an imperfect authentic cadence. It's an authentic cadence because root position 5 goes to root position 1. You can see the leap in the bass from 5 to 1. But it's imperfect because the melody doesn't end on the tonic note. The melody ends on scale degree 3. In other words, an imperfect authentic cadence is harmonically closed. It goes from 5 to 1, but it's melodically open because the melody doesn't end on scale degree 1. It ends on scale degree 3. It's a weaker sense of closure, or it has a more open-ended quality than if we had had a PAC, perfect authentic cadence. And that is why Mozart extends this music with 2 more measures to reach a PAC to provide a greater sense of closure, a sense of completeness. Let's listen to the entire B section and recapitulation once again to hear. I really want you to focus on measure 16 versus measure 18, those 2 cadences. The IAC has a quality of being melodically open. The PAC has a quality of being melodically closed, total closure. Now, you might be wondering, why observe this distinction between PAC and IAC? Especially if your background in music theory is in French, you probably call both of these cadences parfaites, and Anglophone Canadians probably also called both of these perfect cadences. So how come our book distinguishes between PAC and IAC? Does this difference really matter? Did composers think this way? Let's look at some ideas from a book that was written right around Mozart's lifetime with instructions on how to compose. The author's name was Heinrich Christoph Koch. I'm going to translate Koch's ideas from German to English. Also, I'll translate them from 18th century compositional theory into the sorts of theory terms that we'll use in this course. Koch explains that sometimes a composer is approaching the end of a phrase, but might wish to avoid writing a cadence in order that the phrase can last a little longer. So, looking at example 1, where he writes the first trill, that's a signal that the music could be approaching a cadence from 5 to 1. After all, a trill on scale degree 2 could have gone down to scale degree 1 to make a perfect authentic cadence. But if it instead goes up to scale degree 3, it makes what we call an imperfect authentic cadence, and Koch explains that the composer can go on a bit further before reaching a complete cadence, what we call a perfect authentic cadence. I'll play a recording of the example, and we'll hear it 2 different ways. First, we'll hear what it could have sounded like if we had had a PAC after the first trill. Then I'll play it again the way Koch wrote it with the IAC instead. Koch only provided a melody, so I've added the harmony. So you can really hear how the imperfect authentic cadence sounds more open or incomplete compared to the perfect authentic cadence. In example 2, Koch shows pretty much the same thing. Let's hear the recording and then we'll analyze it. Once again, I'll play it 2 ways. First, how it would have sounded if there had been a cadence just after the first trill, and then the way Koch wrote it. After the trilled D, the melody could have descended to C for a perfect authentic cadence, but instead it ascends, goes up through the ornamental note D sharp on the way to E. That E is scale degree 3, the typical melody note for an imperfect authentic cadence, and that necessitates 2 more bars to reach a perfect authentic cadence. Koch's examples 3 and 4 are a little different. Once again, the 5 harmony and the trill set up what could have led to a perfect authentic cadence, but this time the music really surprises us, since the 5 chord does not even lead to a 1 chord. This isn't an authentic cadence, not a PAC or IAC, since 5 didn't go to 1. Instead, it's what's called a deceptive cadence, since the expected cadential tonic chord is replaced by some other harmony. We'll talk more about deceptive cadences later in the course. But this is another way you can avoid having a PAC where you might have expected one. If you've learned about deceptive cadences previously, you might have learned that they usually involve 5 chords going to 6. But in this example, it's a 5 chord going to 2, in a place where you might have expected 5 to go to 1. Now let's listen to example 4, which is especially interesting. So in this example, the 5 chord does go to 1, and the melody does go from a trill D to a C. But, remarkably, Koch considers this still to be a deceptive cadence, since the C is in the wrong octave. And it stands to reason. A perfect authentic cadence usually suggests a relaxation or an arrival at a logical ending point. Da-dee-da-dee-da-dum would be logical. But the leap up an octave, da-dee-da-da-da-dum, suggests something different. It's a feeling of, I'm not quite finished, I have more to say, and once I've said it, then I will reach a cadence. These 4 examples give us a sense of how a musician living around Mozart's period might have thought about cadences. The main point I want to emphasize is that Koch makes a big difference between melodies that end on scale degree 3 and melodies that end on scale degree 1. To put this in our textbook's terms, Koch would have considered imperfect authentic cadences to be incomplete closure, not nearly as strong as perfect authentic cadences. In this course, we will therefore distinguish IAC versus PAC in order to reflect the different sense of closure when we hear these 2 types of cadences. To me, it's a really significant difference, and I hope over the course of the semester you'll begin to appreciate the difference and want to reflect it in your analyses as well. That's probably enough analysis of music straight out of a composition textbook. So let's return to some real music, finishing up this video with a beautiful song by Louise Reichardt entitled Frühlingslied, or Spring Song. As we listen to the first part of the song, let's focus on moments where you hear authentic cadences, root position 5 going to root position 1. Can you hear the difference between IAC and PAC?
Es wärmte sich die Wiese und an den Hecken sah ich blühen. Tagtäglich sah ich neue Kräuter, wild war die Luft, der Himmel heiter. Ich wusste nicht, wie mir geschah und wie das wurde, was ich sah.
I've marked 2 places where we have root position 5 going to root position 1, that is, dominant function to tonic function. Note that we don't have any subdominant function in this passage. To have an authentic cadence, it suffices to have root position dominant to tonic. But what about my question before, about the IAC versus PAC distinction? Which kinds of cadences do we have in these 2 spots? The arrival point at the end of the first system on the word blühen is merely an imperfect authentic cadence. It does go 5/7 to 1, but the melody ends on scale degree 3. So this is a very weak arrival point, an open-ended sense on that word. Whereas at the end of the screen on the word sah, was ich sah, the melody descends to scale degree 1, arriving with complete melodic closure together with harmonic closure. This is a perfect authentic cadence. That's a much stronger sense of articulating the end of a section of music. In fact, that moment is the end of the first verse of the song, or what we sometimes call the first strophe of the song. What does it mean when we say the song has verses or strophes? It means that you'll hear the same music several times in a row as the singer goes from the first stanza of the poem to the next stanza and so on. That's the way this song is organized if you were to hear the whole song. And at the very end of the song, Louise Reichardt composed a special ending for the final verse or the final strophe. So let's listen to the very end of the song and do a bit of analysis.
Uns folgt ihr Wald vor Sonnenschein, das ist der Frühling, fiel mir ein. Kurzum ich sah, dass jetzt auf Erden die Welten sollten göttern. Dann wusst ich meine Scham, und das wurde, was ich sah.
Let's analyze from where it says analyze here, the end of measure 20, to the end of the song. For now, we can focus mostly on the piano part, which outlines the harmonies. And we'll skip the chords that are marked skip, since we're going to learn about those chords later on in the semester. I'll let you pause the video for a second and think about the harmonies. Remember, we learned in a previous week, each time there's a change of a bass note, that probably is a sign that there's a new harmony. What are the harmonies? What are the harmonic functions? And how do they articulate the end of the song? We have a typical harmonic progression here, a typical progression that leads to cadences. 1/6 tonic, 4 subdominant, 5/7 dominant, 1 tonic, and this is a PAC that rounds off the song. The bass line here, A, B flat, C, F, is a very common bass line that you find leading to cadences, scale degrees 3, 4, 5, 1, often correspond to tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic. Let's listen to this end just one last time.
Dann wusst ich meine Scham, und das wurde, was ich sah.
So to wrap up for today, tonic, subdominant, and dominant are the three important harmonic functions in tonal music. If you had a previous teacher who referred to them as tonic, predominant, and dominant, that's the same idea, but since our textbook calls it subdominant, I'll be using S for subdominant. Tonal progressions typically go T, S, D, T, tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic. We saw many progressions today that had tonic expansions followed by subdominant, dominant, tonic. Or tonic, dominant, tonic. Those are the typical progressions that you'll see in this course. What you're not going to see so often are what's sometimes called retrogressions, where dominant leads to subdominant. Instead, we're going to see subdominant prepares for the dominant. That's actually why sometimes people call it predominant. So TSD or TSDT, that's pretty typical, but D leading to S, dominant leading to subdominant, that's rare. The main cadences that you're responsible for at this point in the course: half cadence, that stops on a 5 triad. Most of the music we're going to see with half cadences are going to be 5 triads. Occasionally, especially in 19th century music from the Romantic period, you might find a half cadence on 5/7, but typically it's a 5 triad. Today, I really wanted to emphasize, though, the distinction between the two types of authentic cadences, imperfect authentic cadence versus perfect authentic cadence. Both of them involve root position 5 or 5/7 going to root position 1. The difference is, in an imperfect authentic cadence, the melody, it's not melodically closed. We usually have scale degree 3 in the soprano. Whereas, in a perfect authentic cadence, it's melodically closed. It's complete closure because the melody descends to scale degree 1. And this is the type of closure or strong cadence you get at the ends of pieces, at the ends of sections. Remember those examples we heard from Koch where he said, if you don't want to end yet, try an imperfect authentic cadence. And then later, when you're really ready to end, there you can use a perfect authentic cadence. In this course, we will distinguish IAC versus PAC. I hope when you hear them and you experience them, you feel them as different kinds of cadences, and that means the way we label them should match the way we hear and experience the music. Thank you very much. Have a nice week.